Hey, grammar gurus, what's up? Today's lesson is on clauses. First, let's review. What is a complete sentence? Well, remember, a complete sentence is a group of words that has a subject, a predicate, and a complete thought. So, for example, if you have Mary had a little lamb, your subject is Mary, your predicate is had, and your complete thought is just that chunk by itself. Because grammatically, what a sentence requires in order to have a complete thought is just one complete idea that contains a subject and a predicate and doesn't leave the reader hanging in any way. So the new learning consists around the definition of a clause. A clause, not Santa, but grammatical, is a group of words that contains a subject and a predicate. So any chunk of words that has a subject and a predicate is called a clause. Now, before we move on, there are some definitions you're going to have to memorize so you don't get caught up thinking, wait, what's a coordinate clause again? Wait, what's an independent clause again? And unfortunately, whoever decided on the grammar vocabulary in English couldn't really make up their mind. So we've got a couple of words that mean the same thing. For example, a coordinate clause is the same thing as an independent clause. And those two concepts both mean a complete section. And a subordinate clause, also termed a dependent clause, simply means an incomplete section. Now, regardless of whether you have a coordinate clause or a subordinate clause, remember, because the definition of a clause is any group of words with a subject and a predicate, both a coordinate clause and a subordinate clause will contain a subject and a predicate. So let's talk a little bit more about those two categories of clauses. There are, by the way, only these two categories of clauses. And remember, every clause contains a subject and a predicate. So if you look at a coordinate or independent clause, that is a clause with a subject, a predicate, and a complete thought. Whereas a subordinate or dependent clause is a clause with a subject and a predicate, but it does not have a complete thought. Let's take a look at those examples. If you say the building was old, you can stop right there. You're done. You've got a subject, a predicate, and a complete thought. That is a coordinate clause or an independent clause. But if you say, since the building was old, you now have a clause that has a subject and a predicate, but it cannot stand by itself. I cannot walk up to somebody and go, since the building was old, and then just stop. It just doesn't make sense. And the thing that makes it not make sense is that word at the beginning of its clause. So a way to remember that a subordinate or dependent clause can't stand alone is to recognize that a subordinate or dependent clause contains an extra word at the beginning that makes the clause unable to stand alone. Now, quite often in a subordinate clause, that word at the beginning of the sentence that makes the sentence, that word at the beginning of the clause that makes the clause subordinate, that makes it unable to stand alone, is called a subordinating conjunction. Now, here are a chunk of subordinating conjunctions. There are too many to memorize, but if you will write these down in your notes and then start studying them, it will make you better at detecting them in sentences so that you'll understand whether you have a subordinate clause, meaning a clause that can't stand by itself, or whether you have a coordinate clause, meaning a clause that can stand by itself because it doesn't have one of these subordinating conjunctions at the beginning of its clause. Okay, let's go through those two types of clauses again with a little more detail. So a coordinate or independent clause is a clause that can stand alone as a complete sentence because it contains both subject and predicate and it forms a complete idea. A coordinate clause sitting by itself forms what we call a simple sentence. For example, Terry ran down the street. You have a subject, a predicate, a complete thought. Now, from here on out, we are going to identify complete thoughts in hard brackets like you see in front of you. And as always, we outline the subject and predicate of a coordinate clause in blue and red. Now, if you want to put two coordinating clauses together and you want to combine them correctly using either a semicolon or a comma and a coordinating conjunction, then you will form a compound sentence. For example, if you say Terry ran down the street, comma, for she needed to catch the bus. You have two complete sections, two coordinate or independent clauses, combined using the wonder twins, which is a comma and a coordinating conjunction, so you have formed a compound sentence. Now, a subordinate or dependent clause is a clause that cannot stand alone as a complete sentence because it contains a subject and predicate, but it does not form a complete idea. Now, a subordinate clause often begins with a subordinating conjunction, which is that word that makes the clause incomplete. Now, a subordinate clause standing by itself actually forms a sentence fragment. That's a really bad idea. You don't want to put a subordinate clause in a piece of writing just sitting by itself unless you're doing it very, very deliberately. And in some creative pieces, sometimes a high quality subordinate clause sitting alone as a sentence fragment draws the reader's attention and does something cool. But oftentimes it's there sitting there signaling that it's an error. So you just want to be very, very careful. And for most purposes, you'll want to avoid a fragment. Something like, because Terry ran down the street. Now, let's take a look at visually how we're showing these concepts. Subordinate clauses will be in soft brackets. They will begin with a word that makes that clause soft or subordinate. And if that word is a subordinating conjunction, that's going to be highlighted in pink. And then I've done something interesting with the blue and the red that we use to indicate subject and predicate. Notice that Terry there is still blue, but it's light blue. And ran is still red, but it's light red. That is to indicate that while there is a subject and a predicate in that clause, because it's in a subordinate clause, it cannot be the subject and predicate of the sentence. So bear in mind when you're trying to find subject and predicate of the sentence, never include a subject and predicate from a subordinate clause. Okay, next, a subordinate clause combined with a coordinate clause forms what we call a complex sentence. So if I say, because Terry ran down the street, comma, she caught the bus, that becomes a complex sentence. It begins with a dependent clause, and while that clause has a subject and predicate, it is not the subject and predicate of the sentence, so those blue and red words are softer. It is followed by a coordinate or independent clause that contains the subject and predicate of the sentence, she caught, and those are in bright blue and bright red. Now, if a subordinate clause is combined with two coordinate clauses, then you have a compound complex sentence because you have every element of a compound sentence, which is two coordinate clauses, and you have the element of a complex sentence, which is one subordinate clause and one coordinate clause. So in this case, my compound complex sentence reads, because Terry ran down the street, she caught the bus, so she arrived on time. Now, the subject and the predicate of that sentence is she caught and she arrived. Terry ran is a subject and predicate, but not the subject and predicate because you find it in the subordinate clause or the part that can't stand alone. It's a much less important part. It doesn't get the clout of having the subject and predicate of the sentence in there. It'd be like trying to get an A-lister to come to your party. If you're kind of lame, your A-listers aren't going to come to your party. They're going to the party in Hollywood. The party in Hollywood in a sentence is the coordinate clause, and the lame party is the subordinate clause. Okay, let's talk about how we can use clauses to build sentences. People use clauses as building blocks for their sentences, and folks that are really good writers know how to build one clause on top of another to create really interesting and complicated sentences. So let's go through some of these concepts. A sentence consists of at least one coordinate clause, which is called a simple sentence, like he ran. But a sentence can start with one coordinate clause and then add some random words to it to make a more sophisticated, simple sentence, like, because of the snow, he ran into a ditch in his car. Now, there is only one subject and predicate in that entire sentence. Because of the snow does not contain a subject and a predicate, so it's not a clause. It's just a group of words at the beginning of the sentence. and into a ditch in his car is just additional description. But then a writer can add any number of additional coordinate clauses to one coordinate clause to create their compound sentence. For example, he ran over the ditch, but his car became stuck in the mud, so he stopped the engine. There I have 3 coordinate clauses, all combined using a comma and a coordinating conjunction, and so that becomes a compound sentence. In addition to that, a writer can add any number of subordinate clauses to their one original coordinate clause to create a complex sentence. For example, after he arrived home from school, he ran into a wall because he was closing his eyes. Okay, here we have a subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence after he arrived home from school. It begins with a subordinating conjunction after, which is highlighted in pink. And it contains a subject and predicate, but not the subject and predicate of the sentence because it's not in a complete section. Then you have your complete section. He ran into a wall. It has a subject, a predicate, and a complete thought. Then we tack on another subordinate clause or dependent clause. So we indicate again that it begins with a subordinating conjunction, a word that makes that clause incomplete, and we highlight that in pink. And then we have he was closing. They are a subject and predicate. They are the subject and predicate of that clause, but they are not the subject and predicate of the sentence, because in order to be the subject and the predicate of a sentence, it has to be in the complete section. And then finally, a writer can add any number of subordinate clauses to 2 or more coordinate clauses to create what we call a compound complex sentence. So in this case, you have a compound sentence in he ran into the wall, so he developed a headache. Those 2 coordinate clauses would create a compound sentence. And then you add subordinate clauses to them after he arrived home from school because he was closing his eyes. And so if you add a subordinate clause to an already compound sentence, you then have a compound complex sentence. And so the whole thing would read, after he arrived home from school, he ran into a wall because he was closing his eyes, so he developed a headache. Now, the point of all this is that that sentence is far more compelling and interesting than he ran. Both sentences are grammatically correct, and both sentences have their place in writing. Don't get me wrong. He ran, a 2-word sentence, can do a lot and be very powerful in a piece of writing. But what I want you guys to develop is the ability to write both little sentences, he ran, and long, compound, complex, interesting, sophisticated sentences so that you as writers know how to control your own audience. A quick note about commas and clauses. If you combine 2 or more coordinate clauses with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, you actually have turkey comma rule number 2, which is a compound sentence using the Wonder Twins, a comma and a coordinating conjunction. If you combine a coordinate clause with a subordinate clause, sometimes you've got to put a comma in there, and it just kind of depends. If the subordinate clause comes first, you will always place a comma after that subordinate clause. It's turkey comma rule number 3 because that subordinate clause is always an introductory element. It's unnecessary fluff at the beginning of your sentence. For example, because it rained so hard, comma, the plants bloomed immediately. The main part of your sentence, the coordinate clause, the part with the subject and the predicate of the sentence, is the plants bloomed immediately. Because it rained so hard is just additional fluff. You don't need it to make a grammatically correct sentence. And since that unnecessary part comes at the beginning, you know that you have to separate that unnecessary information with a comma. Now, if the coordinate clause comes first, then typically you do not place any commas. The plants bloomed immediately because it rained so hard. Now, there will be exceptions to that, but we'll get into those a little bit later on in the semester. So to recap, the 4 sentence structures that you can create once you are empowered by the knowledge of clauses and what clauses can do are the following. You can create a simple sentence, which is 1 coordinate or independent clause. You can create a compound sentence, which is 2 or more coordinate or independent clauses. You can create a complex sentence, which is 1 coordinate or independent clause combined with any number of subordinate or dependent clauses. You can put those subordinate, dependent clauses all over the place, and as long as there is only 1 coordinate clause, you have a complex sentence. And finally, there is a compound complex sentence, which is two or more coordinate or independent clauses combined with any number of subordinate or dependent clauses. It's going to be really important, critically important, in fact, for you guys to go home and memorize these 4-sentence structures and how to create them. All right, let's look at some examples of each. A simple sentence is one coordinate clause. Racism is a complicated topic. A compound sentence is two coordinate clauses. Racism is a complicated topic and it is difficult to discuss. A complex sentence would be a coordinate clause followed by any number of subordinate clauses. Since racism is a complicated topic, many people choose not to discuss it. So there you have one coordinate clause, many people choose not to discuss it. And you also have a subordinate clause, a piece that can't stand by itself because of the word since. And then finally, you have compound complex sentences, which is two coordinate clauses combined with any number of subordinate clauses. Since racism is a complicated topic, many people choose not to discuss it, but it demands our attention. So in that case, your two coordinate clauses are many people choose not to discuss it, and it demands our attention. They both contain a subject and a predicate, and the fluff is since racism is a complicated topic. That is not as important as the two coordinate clauses. So it goes at the beginning and it is followed by a comma because it is not mandatory information. Now, what I'd like you to do in your own notes is to try and come up with your own examples for a simple sentence, a compound sentence, a complex sentence, and a compound complex sentence. And for each of those, I would like for you, please, to identify your coordinate clauses using hard brackets, your subordinating clauses using soft brackets. If you have coordinating conjunctions like the fanboys, I want you to put those in boxes. And if you have subordinating conjunctions like since, I want you to circle those. Then I want you to underline each subject of your sentence once and each predicate twice. Now, if you are identifying the subject and predicate of a subordinate clause, I want you to just dot underline, not full underline, so that we understand those are not the subject and predicate of the sentence, just of that clause. All right, thanks so much, and we'll see you in class.